The neighborhood looked perfect from the outside. Rows of identical homes lined pristine streets, every lawn clipped to the same length, every mailbox painted the same dull shade of black. To anyone driving through, it was the picture of order, control, and quiet respectability. But to those who lived there, the perfection had a cost. Behind the symmetry and rules was an HOA that governed with an iron fist, led by a board that thrived on nitpicking, fines, and power. For years, the homeowner at the center of this story had stayed out of trouble. They mowed the lawn, kept their house freshly painted, and parked their vehicles exactly as the handbook dictated. But the backyard, hidden from the street, was their sanctuary. It was a place of freedom, where life wasn't measured against bylaws and restrictions. Birds gathered in the trees, the family dog ran freely, and the garden grew vibrant with color. To keep this sanctuary private, the homeowner decided to replace the old, weathered fence with something sturdier, taller, and more secure. The original fence had stood for nearly 20 years. Its boards were warped, its posts leaning, and gaps between planks offered little privacy. The new design was elegant yet simple solid cedar boards, standing 6 feet tall, stained in a warm, natural hue. It wasn't garish. It wasn't offensive. It was just a well-built fence, meant to provide peace and seclusion. For a few days after its completion, life felt better. The backyard felt transformed into a safe haven, a place shielded from nosy neighbors and HOA patrols. But that peace didn't last long. One morning, a white envelope appeared taped to the front door. The letter inside bore the HOA's letterhead, written in stern, impersonal language. It stated that the fence was in violation of community guidelines, which only permitted fences to be a maximum of 5 feet tall. The violation came with a warning: lower the fence or face daily fines. At first, the homeowner thought it was a mistake. After all, several fences in the community appeared just as tall. They assumed it was only a matter of pointing out the inconsistency and the issue would be resolved. But when they reached out to the HOA, the board doubled down. According to them, the fence was an eyesore and out of compliance, and no exceptions would be made. The frustration simmered. The fence wasn't an eyesore. It wasn't even visible from the street, hidden behind trees and landscaping. It didn't block anyone's view, nor did it encroach on another property. The rule seemed less about aesthetics and more about control. And while most homeowners might have caved, cutting their fence down or paying endless fines, this homeowner wasn't like most. Days passed, and the letters continued. Each one grew more aggressive, threatening larger penalties and legal action. Neighbors began whispering about the situation, some siding with the homeowner, others warning them to just give in. The HOA had a reputation for crushing resistance, and many feared what would happen if the fight escalated. But something inside the homeowner hardened. Why should they give in to an unfair rule, especially when others were allowed to break it without consequence? Why should they tear down something that brought peace to their own backyard just to satisfy the petty whims of a power-hungry board? The more they thought about it, the more determined they became. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about standing up against hypocrisy and overreach. One evening, as the sun set behind the row of nearly identical houses, the homeowner stood in their yard, looking at the fence. To outsiders, it was just wood and nails. But to them, it was a symbol of privacy, of peace, of independence. The HOA wanted it gone, and that meant it had to stay. The war had only just begun. The first fine arrived less than a week after the warning letter. A crisp white envelope, with bold red lettering across the top. NAOT CAO FANAONA compliance. $100 fine. It didn't come by mail, but was hand-shoved into the mailbox like a threat. One fine turned into two. Two became three. By the end of the month, the tally had reached nearly $1,000. Each letter colder and more threatening than the last. The HOA didn't just want compliance, they wanted submission. They wanted the homeowner to bend, to admit defeat, and to prove that their rules held absolute authority over the neighborhood. Neighbors began to notice the tension. Some shook their heads in quiet sympathy, whispering words of encouragement when the board wasn't around. Others avoided eye contact, afraid to be associated with someone openly resisting the regime. And then there were those who sided with the HOA, parroting the same tired lines about community standards and property values, as though the slightly taller fence were the gravest threat the neighborhood had ever faced. But the homeowner didn't back down. Instead, they began to dig deeper. If the HOA wanted to play by the book, then the book would be used against them. The first discovery came from the community's own architectural guidelines. Buried in the dense legal jargon was a clause that allowed for reasonable variances to fencing height when justified for privacy, safety, or property protection. The homeowner's case fit all three. Their backyard bordered a walking path, and without the taller fence, strangers often peered in or tossed litter over the old, sagging boards. The new fence wasn't just aesthetic, it was functional, necessary, and reasonable. The second discovery was even more damning. Several homes in the neighborhood had fences equal to or taller than 6 feet. Photographs were taken, each time-stamped, and some of these fences had stood for years without so much as a notice. It wasn't about the fence, it was about selective enforcement. Meanwhile, the HOA's tactics grew nastier. Anonymous complaints were filed against the homeowner for law neglect and improper storage of garbage bins. Inspectors from the board appeared unannounced, snapping photos of the yard, the driveway, even the back porch. Every minor imperfection became an excuse to send another notice, another fine. But intimidation only fueled determination. The homeowner kept meticulous records of every notice, every fine, every visit. A binder thick with documentation grew heavier by the week. Copies of the bylaws, highlighted and annotated, sat beside photos of the neighborhood's many rule-breaking fences. The evidence was building like bricks in a wall, ironically, the very wall the HOA would one day pay for. Still, the pressure mounted. Letters from the HOA's attorney soon followed, threatening legal action if the fines weren't paid and the fence wasn't lowered. The language was harsh, filled with words like liability and foreclosure, meant to scare. But fear had long since passed. What remained was resolve. The breaking point came at the next HOA board meeting. Word had spread that the homeowner planned to confront the board directly, and the community center was packed. Karen, the board president, sat at the front like a queen on her throne, smug and unyielding. When the homeowner presented their case, the variance clause, the photos of other fences, the stack of notices, it should have been enough to silence the room. But Karen brushed it all aside. According to her, none of it mattered. The fence was too tall, and the rules were the rules. End of discussion. But what she didn't realize was that her arrogance had lit a spark. Neighbors who had remained silent now whispered louder. Others began to grumble about their own fines, their own frustrations. Karen might have dismissed one homeowner, but she couldn't dismiss the growing discontent in the room. The meeting ended with no resolution, but the battle lines were drawn. The HOA had chosen war, and now the homeowner was ready to fight it to the very end. The fence had started it, but what was coming would shake the very foundation of the HOA itself. The weeks following the board meeting were tense. The HOA doubled down, sending more notices and escalating the fines. What began as a few $100s had now grown into thousands, with daily penalties piling up like sand in an hourglass. To the board, this was a game of attrition. They believed no homeowner could withstand the weight of endless fees and threats. They believed submission was inevitable, but they underestimated two things: the homeowner's patience and their willingness to fight back with the very system the HOA abused. The binder of evidence had grown into 2, then 3, each filled with neatly organized files. Photos of other non-compliant fences, emails between residents and the board showing selective enforcement, copies of state laws that limited how far HOAs could push fines without due process. Every detail was documented, cataloged, and prepared. The homeowner wasn't just collecting evidence for defense, they were building a case for attack. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself began to fracture. Those tired of Karen's control started whispering their support. They admitted to their own frustrations. Being fined for leaving a trash can visible for a single night, or for planting flowers outside the HOA-approved pallet. For years, these small abuses had been tolerated because no one dared resist. But now, with one neighbor standing firm, the resentment began to bubble into something more. On the other side, Karen's loyalists grew louder, painting the homeowner as a troublemaker. They claimed the fight would ruin property values, that standing up against the HOA would invite chaos into the neighborhood. Karen herself fanned the flames, sending newsletters filled with exaggerated claims about the disruption caused by the fence. She painted herself as a protector, defending the community from unruly neighbors. But beneath the veneer of control, cracks were forming. The HOA's finances were dwindling. Legal letters and enforcement efforts were expensive, and many of the board's actions bordered on overreach. Karen brushed aside concerns from other board members, insisting that the fight had to continue at all costs. It wasn't about the fence anymore, it was about her pride, her authority, and her refusal to lose. The homeowner, however, had begun consulting with an attorney of their own. It wasn't just about the fence now, it was about holding the HOA accountable for harassment, selective enforcement, and abuse of power. The attorney quickly recognized the strength of the case. With evidence of other tall fences, records of excessive fines, and proof that state law had been ignored, the HOA wasn't just vulnerable, they were exposed. The first step was filing a formal legal challenge, disputing the fines, and demanding a variance under the community's own bylaw. When the HOA refused, the attorney escalated, filing a lawsuit alleging harassment, selective enforcement, and violation of property rights. News of the lawsuit spread like wildfire. Neighbors who once stayed quiet now leaned closer, eager to hear updates. Some offered copies of their own violation letters to support the case, adding fuel to the growing fire. The lawsuit wasn't just one homeowner's battle anymore. It was becoming a rallying point for everyone who had ever felt victimized by Karen's board. Karen, of course, remained unshaken, at least outwardly. She dismissed the lawsuit as frivolous, boasting that the HOA's legal team would crush it quickly. But behind closed doors, she was frantic. The board's insurance premiums spiked, legal fees mounted, and whispers of a recall began circulating among the residents. Her grip on power was slipping, no matter how tightly she tried to hold it. And through it all, the fence stood tall, a symbol of defiance. By the end of the chapter, the neighborhood was no longer united under Karen's rule. It was divided, with one side quietly cheering the homeowner's courage and the other clinging to Karen's crumbling authority. The stage was set for a confrontation bigger than fines or fence posts. The battle had left the neighborhood simmering, and soon, everything would come to a boiling point. The day of the first hearing arrived like a storm on the horizon. The homeowner, dressed with quiet confidence, entered the courthouse carrying binders thick with evidence. Every page told a story, not just of one fence, but of a pattern of control and abuse that had spread like a shadow across the neighborhood. The HOA's representatives arrived shortly after, Karen leading the charge with a forced smile and a stack of her own documents. Behind her trailed the HOA's attorney, visibly exhausted from weeks of preparation, already anticipating the uphill battle. To Karen, this was about crushing resistance. To the lawyer, it was about minimizing damage. Their goals were not aligned, and that disconnect would soon become painfully obvious. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with anticipation. Residents who had taken time off work filled the gallery seats. Some came to quietly support the homeowner. Others came out of morbid curiosity, eager to see whether Karen would finally be challenged in a setting she couldn't control. The arguments began with the HOA's side, presenting their case with confident bluster. They painted the fence as an egregious violation, a threat to the neighborhood's uniform aesthetic, and a dangerous precedent if left unchecked. Karen sat proudly as her lawyer spoke, nodding with every exaggeration, convinced that this performance would secure victory. But then, it was the homeowner's turn. With calm precision, their attorney dismantled the HOA's claims, piece by piece. Photographs were displayed showing at least half a dozen fences of similar or greater height scattered throughout the neighborhood, none of which had been fined. Copies of letters revealed how minor infractions had been punished selectively, often targeting those who had clashed with Karen in the past. Even financial records surfaced, showing questionable spending of HOA funds on unnecessary administrative costs that coincidentally aligned with Karen's personal interests. The judge's demeanor shifted with every piece of evidence. What began as a simple dispute over a fence was unraveling into something much larger, a pattern of harassment and selective enforcement that painted the HOA not as a protector of property values, but as a weapon wielded by one woman's ego. Karen grew restless in her seat, whispering furiously to the lawyer, her composure cracking. She had always controlled the narrative in the neighborhood, twisting stories to her advantage. But here, under oath, and under scrutiny, her carefully curated image was slipping away. When the homeowner's attorney introduced testimony from neighbors' residents who had endured years of unfair fines and bullying, the courtroom murmured with unease. Some neighbors had been fined for children's toys left outside for a single afternoon. Others had been threatened with liens for garden decorations. The stories painted a portrait of a community suffocated under rules applied unevenly and unfairly. By the time the first hearing ended, the HOA's case looked fragile. The judge ordered a temporary halt to all fines related to the fence until the matter was fully resolved. A decision that sent Karen into a silent rage. For the first time, she wasn't the one dictating the terms. Outside the courthouse, whispers spread quickly. Neighbors who had once lived in fear of Karen's power now felt a spark of hope. The homeowner had not only stood against the board, but had landed real blows in a place where Karen's influence held no weight. The lawsuit was far from over, but the tide was turning. Each court date became a gathering point for residents, a stage where Karen's authority unraveled in full view. The legal costs mounted, draining the HOA's budget at a frightening pace. Special assessments loomed on the horizon, and murmurs of mismanagement echoed louder in every conversation. Back at home, the fence remained untouched, standing taller now as a symbol of resilience. For the homeowner, it was never just about wood and nails. It was about the principle that no single person, no matter how loud or controlling, should dictate the lives of an entire community. And as the next round of hearings approached, the homeowner's attorney hinted at something even bigger. If the evidence continued to point toward financial misconduct within the HOA, this case could expand beyond the fence and into the very structure of the association itself. The battle had moved from the yard to the courtroom, and soon it would spill back into the neighborhood, threatening to unravel the HOA from the inside. The courtroom battles had left scars on the HOA, not just financially, but in its reputation. Every hearing pulled back another layer of secrecy, revealing questionable decisions and a history of selective punishment that no one could deny anymore. What had once been whispered over fences and sidewalks was now a matter of public record, and the residents could no longer ignore the rot that had festered within their own neighborhood association. As legal fees piled up, the HOA board scrambled to cover costs. Notices of special assessments were slipped into mailboxes, announcing that every household would need to contribute hundreds of dollars to the association's legal defense. The letters were written in the usual official tone, but neighbors read them with anger and disbelief. Why should they pay to fight a battle that served only Karen's ego? Tension grew like storm clouds over the community. On the streets, conversations turned bitter. Neighbors who had once quietly tolerated Karen's control now vented openly, their patience shattered by the thought of paying out of pocket for her crusade. Meetings of the board, once sparsely attended, became battlegrounds filled with raised voices and pointed questions. The other board members, once loyal to Karen or too afraid to challenge her, began to distance themselves. The weight of defending her decisions was sinking them too. Meanwhile, the homeowner who had started it all went about their days with quiet determination. The fence still stood, untouched, as the court's temporary order protected it from fines. Every time neighbors walked past it, they saw more than wood. They saw proof that Karen could be challenged, and that resistance wasn't futile. The fence became a rallying point, a symbol of defiance against years of petty tyranny. Word spread beyond the neighborhood. Local reporters caught wind of the dispute, and soon cameras appeared at HOA meetings. News segments painted Karen not as a protector of community values, but as the face of overreach and authoritarian petty. Interviews with residents revealed years of frustration, painting a damning picture for the HOA's public image. The more Karen tried to control the narrative, the more foolish she appeared. Clips of her losing her temper during interviews circulated online, transforming her into an unwilling internet spectacle. Financial strain turned into desperation. The HOA lawyer warned that without a settlement, the association risked bankruptcy. But Karen refused to back down, insisting they had to make an example out of the homeowner. Her words only deepened the divide. Board members, facing angry neighbors at their doorsteps, began resigning one by one, unwilling to sink with her ship. The community reached a breaking point. Petitions circulated calling for Karen's removal. Residents demanded transparency, requesting full access to financial records. The homeowner's legal team, sensing the momentum, filed additional motions targeting the HOA's bookkeeping, bringing potential fraud into the spotlight. Each new revelation tightened the noose around Karen's authority. In private, Karen grew frantic. She had built her identity around control, her reputation on power over her neighbors. But now, the empire she had crafted from fear and fines was crumbling. For the first time, she faced real consequences, and she could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. And then, the ultimate blow landed. The judge ruled that the HOA's enforcement of the fence rule had been discriminatory and inconsistent. Not only was the fine voided, but the HOA was ordered to cover a portion of the homeowner's legal costs. The decision left the association's finances in ruins, and its credibility shattered. The ruling was a victory, but the story wasn't over. With financial collapse looming and Karen's grip on power slipping, the residents had to decide what came next. Would they dismantle the HOA entirely, or rebuild it from the ground up without her? As the dust settled, the homeowner stood in their yard, looking at the fence that had started it all. What once felt like a personal battle had grown into something far bigger, a war that had reshaped the neighborhood. The cracks in the HOA had become fissures, and soon, the whole structure would come crashing down. The fight wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about freedom, accountability, and the downfall of a tyrant who had ruled unchecked for far too long. And as the next chapter began, the collapse of the HOA was no longer a possibility, it was inevitable. The neighborhood had reached its boiling point. The court ruling had already gutted the HOA's finances. But the final blow came not from a judge, but from the very residents who had once lived under Karen's shadow. Petitions circulated through the cul-de-sacs, signatures collected on porches and at kitchen tables. Neighbors who had long remained silent now eagerly joined the effort, united by frustration and the desire to take back control of their community. The vote to dissolve the HOA came faster than anyone expected. At the emergency meeting, the turnout was overwhelming. Rows of folding chairs filled the clubhouse, and more people stood along the walls. For the first time, Tirumuasen, Hostora afraid it buzzed with energy, the kind of determination that comes when people realize they be at an. Karen sat at the head table, her face drawn and pale. She tried to speak, but her words were drowned by the sea of voices calling for her resignation. The other board members, weary from months of scandal and harassment at their doors, offered no defense. They knew it was over. One by one, the residents raised their hands, casting their votes. When the tally was complete, the result was undeniable. The HOA was finished. The announcement rippled through the crowd, first with cheers, then with laughter, and finally with relief. Years of tension broke in an instant. The power Karen had wielded over the smallest details of their lives was gone, stripped away by the collective will of the very people she had sought to control. For Karen, the fall was absolute. With no HOA to back her, she was left exposed. The lawsuits had drained her reputation and her resources. Neighbors who once feared her now avoided her with disdain, whispering about her downfall as she passed. The woman who had once strutted through the neighborhood with authority was now an outcast in the very place she had ruled. The homeowner, whose fence had sparked the battle, stood quietly as the meeting ended. Their victory was not just personal, it was communal. What had begun as a fight over a too-tall fence had torn down an entire system of control. The fence still stood proudly in their yard, a wooden monument to resilience and resistance. Neighbors stopped by to thank them, acknowledging that their willingness to fight had freed everyone. Without the HOA's grip, the community began to breathe again. Neighbors painted their homes the colors they liked, parked their vehicles in their own driveways, and decorated their yards without fear of fines. Far from descending into chaos, the neighborhood flourished. People began helping each other more, cooperating not because they were forced, but because they chose to. Months later, the scars of the battle remained in stories told over backyard barbecues and block parties. The downfall of the HOA became a kind of legend, a cautionary tale of what happens when control becomes tyranny. The fence was no longer just a fence, it was a symbol, a reminder that one